I'll start this lesson off by giving you an understanding of what Hyper-V can do for you and an overview of the major new features with the release of Hyper-V in Windows Server 2012. So with that, let's get started. So what can Hyper-V do for you? Well, the most common use is to run physical servers or end-user desktops on many fewer physical servers in the data center, consolidating your physical servers into virtual machines running underneath Hyper-V. This is also called P2V or physical to virtual consolidation. Once companies have achieved that, more and more new servers are being put directly underneath Hyper-V as virtual machines. Besides server consolidation, Hyper-V can make your life as an admin vastly easier by offering virtual machine portability and hardware independence so that your servers and applications are no longer tied to specific physical servers and they can be moved around as needed from one Hyper-V host to another. Of course, your company will enjoy the cost savings brought by Hyper-V, but as a Hyper-V admin, Hyper-V will provide your day-to-day life greater flexibility by allowing you to do things in the data center you never dreamed possible and faster than ever before. Additionally, Hyper-V will make high availability and disaster recovery easy and affordable. Now let's review the major features of Hyper-V, including the new features in Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V. We'll start off with virtual networks. Hyper-V virtual networks connect virtual machines together and connect those virtual machines to the physical network. By using Hyper-V virtual networks, you'll need fewer physical Ethernet switch ports in the data center, which will save you money and also ease the burden of network management. The new Hyper-V extensible virtual switch will allow you to add features like packet analysis, virtual firewall, and anti-malware protection built in to the hypervisor, reducing the need for physical firewalls in the data center. Hyper-V already offered shared storage by allowing you to connect your server to an iSCSI storage area network. New with Hyper-V in Windows Server 2012 is the Virtual Fiber Channel Connection, which allows you to connect virtual machines directly to fiber channel storage area networks. Also new is a virtual hard disk format that increases the maximum storage size per virtual machine hard disk up to 64 terabytes of storage. Additionally, it provides built-in protection from corruption and performance degradation on large sector disks. While the previous version of Hyper-V offered live migration, which allows you to move running virtual machines from one host to another with no downtime, the new version of Hyper-V now offers what they call Shared Nothing Live Migration. With Shared Nothing Live Migration, you can perform live migrations without the need to set up failover clustering or clustered shared volumes. The new version of Hyper-V also allows you to perform live migrations at up to 10 gigabit Ethernet speeds, and you can also perform more than one live migration at a time. Also in the new Hyper-V is the ability to move virtual machine hard drives from one physical storage to another without downtime to the end users and applications running on that virtual machine. Windows Server 2012 offers failover clustering, which allows you to provide high availability for applications like Microsoft Exchange, Microsoft SQL Server, file servers, and even Hyper-V. That means that if a Hyper-V server fails, you can use failover clustering to restart the virtual machines that were running on that server. Also new in Windows Server 2012 is the ability to support failover clusters that scale up to 64 physical Hyper-V nodes and up to 4,000 virtual machines. Another new feature is Hyper-V Replica. This allows you to replicate virtual machines between storage systems, clusters, and data centers in two sites to provide business continuity and disaster recovery. This is a great new feature for medium and small businesses that could never afford expensive disaster recovery solutions. With the release of Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V, there are new virtual machine conversion tools that allow you to convert from physical machines into Hyper-V virtual machines, as well as from other hypervisors such as VMware vSphere. And finally, Hyper-V Server is available in a standalone free edition, which offers all the same advanced functionality of Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V, but without a local graphical user interface. I'll be showing you how to download, install, and manage free Hyper-V Server later in this training course. Now let's move on and talk about Hyper-V Manager, the primary tool that you'll be using on a day-to-day basis to manage your new Hyper-V infrastructure. Hyper-V Manager is a Windows application that will be installed along with the Hyper-V role when enabled on a Windows Server 2012 server. I'll show you how it works in just a minute. But first, let's talk about using Hyper-V Manager remotely. So when I say remotely, I'm talking about running Hyper-V Manager on a system other than the Windows Server 2012 host where the Hyper-V role has been enabled. You can run Hyper-V Manager remotely on a Windows 8 client that has the Hyper-V role installed. You could then use that Hyper-V Manager to manage Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V hosts. You could also install the Remote Server Administration Toolkit, RSAT, on Windows 8, even if you hadn't enabled the client Hyper-V role. You can use System Center 2012, which is Microsoft's centralized management tool for managing multiple Hyper-V hosts, or you could use PowerShell, both of which I'll talk about in just a second. Now let's go over to Hyper-V Manager on the Hyper-V server that we've recently installed. I'm here on host Hyper-V1 at the Wired Brain Coffee Company, which we recently installed, and by default the Server Manager dashboard comes up here in Windows Server 2012. Now there's actually a few different ways to access the Hyper-V Manager. You can go up here to Tools inside Server Manager if it's already up and go down to Hyper-V Manager. You can go over here to the Hyper-V role, and there's our Hyper-V host. I can actually right click on it and I can go down, I can start Hyper-V Manager here, or I can go down to the Start menu and then notice the Hyper-V Manager icon here. I'm just going to go ahead and click on that and bring up Hyper-V Manager. Now notice on the left-hand side here that Hyper-V Manager is running, and we've got one Hyper-V host here, Hyper-V1. If I right-click on the Hyper-V Manager here, I could say I wanted to connect to another Hyper-V host. So I could actually manage multiple Hyper-V hosts from a single Hyper-V Manager tool running locally on the Windows Server system or remotely on a Windows 8 client that has the Hyper-V role enabled or the Remote Server Administration tools. So if I select the Hyper-V server that's local to us, which we've installed, notice here in the center I've got information about the virtual machines. Of course, at this point we haven't yet created any virtual machines, which we'll be doing in the next lesson. Here we've got information about snapshots for the virtual machine that's selected, and then more detailed information about the virtual machine. What you'll spend most of your time doing is using the actions over here on the right-hand side. And these actions are contextual, meaning depending on what you select over here on the left-hand side or which virtual machines you select, these actions will change. For example, right now, because I've selected the Hyper-V host, I've got information here on creating new virtual machines, new hard disk, and new floppy disks. I also have actions here that I can perform to import new virtual machines, configure this Hyper-V server's settings, configure virtual switches and virtual networks, use the Virtual Storage Area Network Manager, edit virtual disk, inspect virtual disk, stop the Hyper-V services on this host, remove the server, or refresh my view. On this Actions menu, the most logical thing that you would do as a new Hyper-V admin is to go in here and to create a new virtual machine on the Hyper-V host so you can really get started taking advantage of Hyper-V. Of course, as I said, we'll be doing that in the next lesson. So now let's go in and let's check out this server's Hyper-V settings. Inside the Hyper-V settings, this is where you would configure things like the default location for virtual hard disk for each of the virtual machines on this host, virtual machine configuration files, advanced performance features like NUMA spanning, live migration, storage migration, and replication configuration, and then default user preferences related to the keyboard and mouse. Since we're using Hyper-V Manager and we're pointing it to this individual Hyper-V host, Hyper-V1, all these configuration settings are set per host. So you would have to go to each host that Hyper-V Manager is communicating with, or each host that you have in your data center, and make these configuration settings. However, if you had something like System Center 2012, you could much more easily manage multiple Hyper-V hosts. If we cancel out of this so that we don't make any changes, something else I want to point out is that all the actions you see on the right are also available up here on the Actions menu drop-down, and Help is always just a click away. If you click the Help button here, this brings up help information for configuring Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V, as well as many online links to Microsoft TechNet. Now, if you were running Hyper-V Manager from, let's say, a Windows 8 desktop that had the client Hyper-V role enabled, or another Windows desktop that had the remote server administration tools installed, administration of this Hyper-V host and its virtual machines would be identical. It's the exact same Hyper-V Manager application. You would just be pointing it from your local computer to this remote Hyper-V host that you're managing over the network using Hyper-V Manager. From Hyper-V Manager, let's move on now and talk about managing Hyper-V with System Center. Microsoft's new System Center 2012 is what will offer you centralized management of multiple Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines. It includes a virtual machine library, which is where you can keep your virtual machine templates so that you can quickly roll out or provision new virtual machines based on clones or copies of existing virtual machines or golden images that you've created in the past. It has a virtualization self-service portal so that you could assign rights to power users at your company to deploy their own virtual machines based on templates in the virtual machine library. You should know that new with System Center 2012, the standalone product System Center Virtual Machine Manager, or SCVMM, has been replaced with just System Center 2012. There are no more standalone products. There's only System Center 2012. In fact, if you go over to the Microsoft System Center website, you can see all the different capabilities here that System Center offers you, and one of them is Virtual Machine Manager underneath Infrastructure Management. If you haven't already, I encourage you to take a look at System Center 2012 to learn about its capabilities managing multiple virtual machines and Hyper-V hosts. You can download a free evaluation of System Center 2012 and even import it as a VHD into your Hyper-V server. I talked about managing Hyper-V using the graphical Hyper-V Manager, which is what we'll be primarily using in this training course, as well as how to manage Hyper-V servers and virtual machines using System Center 2012. Now let's move on and briefly talk about managing Hyper-V servers and virtual machines from a command line interface. The way to do this is to use PowerShell. Microsoft PowerShell offers Hyper-V commandlets, which are administration commands that can be run from the command line and can be scripted. If you go to this website here over at TechNet, you'll find that Microsoft offers a plethora of Hyper-V commandlets. If you look over on the left here, and if we scroll down, look at all these commandlets. Every one of these is an individual command that has its own parameters and that you can add to a script. PowerShell is a great way to automate common tasks and streamline the management of your Hyper-V infrastructure. You can run PowerShell commands remotely from any Windows 8 desktop as well as any Windows 7 desktop that has PowerShell installed. You can also run PowerShell locally on a Windows Server 2012 host that has Hyper-V enabled. You can also run PowerShell commands to manage Hyper-V on a Windows Server 2012 host with the Hyper-V role enabled. But what if you have a Windows Server core system or even the free Hyper-V Server 2012 operating system? To administer those, either you'll have to use Hyper-V Manager or System Center remotely, or from the console of those hosts, yes, you can use Hyper-V PowerShell commandlets just like you see here. And that brings us back to our slides. In this lesson, we learned what Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V is and what it can do for you. I showed you how to use the Hyper-V Manager tool, of which we'll be focusing on in this video training course. I also covered how to manage Hyper-V servers remotely using Hyper-V Manager through either the Windows 8 Client Hyper-V role or the remote server administration tools. And then finally, I covered how System Center 2012 and PowerShell could be used to aid you in managing and administering multiple Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines. Thanks for watching.